Hello and welcome to week 10 of Introduction to Diversity. I'm very excited to have this lecture today. The entire time leading up to this lecture just got me thinking about tons and tons of things, like what do you even title this lecture? Is it Asian American? Should it be divided into Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese Americans? Should it be Asian Americans and Asian Pacific Americans? Should it be Asian Americans, Hawaiians, Asian Pacific Americans? And then people from India, and then also people from Pakistan, and then what about Mongolia? And what about Russia? Isn't that Asia? What exactly is Asian? That's the goal of this class. Again, so first and foremost, remember that Asian is a pan-ethnicity, just like white or Hispanic. It's just a grouping of people from across many, many countries into one category, into a socially constructed racial category, something that we created the boundaries for, the criteria for. So again, what does it mean to be an Asian American? It means to be somewhere in 1/3 of the landmass of the earth. I don't even know, right? Again, it's very confusing, but again, pan-ethnicity, it's a big word. It's a hugely diverse place. If we were in anthropology, we'd be looking at culture, overall life, lifestyle, way of life. But we're in sociology. So here we're focusing on social structures and conflict and the meaning attached to our interaction, for example. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So then what do we mean when we're talking about the Asian experience in the United States, for example? Well, what is the Asian experience in the United States? How did an Asian get here in the first place? Well, it turns out they've been traveling here by boat for so long. They crossed the Bering Strait, so arguably are Native Americans Asian? Where does the ancestry of Native American come from? Did they come from Russia? Did they come from South America? Did they come from Africa to South America? Because long before Columbus, people were traveling from South America to Africa and then migrating up to North America and then blending with people from Asia because the world has been globally connected before. So again, when you think about race, where did Native Americans come from? Are they Asian? Cool questions, right? Okay, so things that you guys should be thinking about all the time as we study sociology. All right, so Asian Americans in the United States. So a lot of them, you can argue, come over when we needed labor. So you started seeing the migration in the 1800s, and then we're going to study the Chinese Exclusion Act. And when they excluded the Chinese, for example, they just pretty much grouped all Asians in there, including people from India. The U.S. treatment of Asians has been mixed. They've been tolerated very well, and then at other times not tolerated very well. There was a lot of intolerance. Okay, so it just kind of fluctuates depending on what time in history you're talking about. And as you read the chapter, you kind of get a sense for that. We're like, we need a lower class workforce, so we encourage the immigration. But then there came a point where we began to discourage the immigration because of whatever reason, usually based upon prejudice and discrimination. And always remember that immigration is good for a country because it creates higher gross domestic product. So you want immigration to improve the economy. And so again, anytime you see prejudice against immigration, I'm always like, so what? You guys don't want a good economy? That's what you're saying. So again, a lot of stuff to think about when it comes to Asian Americans. A lot of back and forth on the treatment of Asian Americans. And again, you can go on the side projects of culture and things like that, which you can with all the groups that we can study in this class. However, in sociology, culture, it's the thing we talk about. It's an influence, but it's just one thing we're looking at. Whereas anthropology, it's all culture. It's obsession with culture. Okay, so hence you kind of see the differentiation in the fields and what each field focuses on. So here I wrote Asian Pacific American because is it all Asians along the Pacific coast, which then would include India and Asian Pacific Islanders and Hawaii, which is really far away, which they came from Polynesia following the birds. I get that. So and then what about the people that are Asian that are on the land, and what about the landlocked Asians, such as people like in Mongolia and Tibet and places, So yeah, it just makes you think about a lot of stuff. But here we go. So again, diversity. Asian is diverse. Asian Pacific. It's a huge number of nationalities and cultures. 22 million Asians under that pan ethnicity in the U.S. The majority Pacific Islanders, Chinese, Asian Indians, which is people from India or Pakistan, Filipino, Korean, Vietnamese, Japanese, other Asian, and we have all the percentages broken out. Obviously, you see the highest rate being Chinese and Indian. Again, we're talking about this pan-Asian identity, this concept of pan-ethnicity. When did all Asians become the same? Are they the same? Does a Korean actually think they're the same as a Chinese person, or do they think they're a different race? So Asians have experienced a struggle to find their identity because they have to find a white role in America. You know, again, in America, how easy is it to hold on to your culture when you're here? We are multicultural, but you know, are we a country of assimilation? Are we a country of accommodation? You know, things to think about. So again, holding on to our identity with our country is a thing we all struggle with. Okay. So Asians definitely have that country of origin identification, but they also identify with being American, which is the idea of like the dual consciousness, for example, to identifying with two different groups. Okay, there is solidarity again amongst Asians in the United States, but again, how do you maintain your culture identity, you know, while assimilating into an entirely new culture, which is the melting pot of America, a little bit of all cultures, right? But is America white? Is that what it means to be American, to be white? Or is America far more than that? And as I hope you guys can see, it's so much more than that because just within white, we all have our subdiversities. Like I'm Irish and German and Welsh and Native American. So I'm very aware of am I white or am I all just four of those? Do I have like a quattro consciousness, you know? But people don't think about it like that. People are just like, well, we're all white, right? Well, no, are we? You know, you got to start asking a whole lot of questions about what it really means to have a racial identity, and then how does it relate to the country of origin and the culture you identify with, and then the country you actually live in right now, for example, okay? Um, the Asians do have a lot of success. You will find that Asians have a higher educational level than whites. However, there are far more whites. Therefore, there are a lot more educational attainment degrees afforded to whites than there are Asians, which is one reason that whites maintain control over elite upper class positions compared to lower class positions that don't generally require an education. So affirmative action has benefited Asians, but again, how much of it's cultural and the economic status and the education? Is that part of being culture? Is it about the hard work and it's just going to college and doing what needs to be done? Is that something that's part of Asian culture, for example? Okay. Yellow Peril, your book talks about, this is the slang term for the prejudice against Asians. Asians have historically been institutionally discriminated against. Again, the only group that has ever had their citizenships revoked, their citizenship rights, are Asians with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay, even I mean, African Americans weren't citizens, and neither were women. But once they got their citizenship, we never stripped it from them. But we did take it from Asians. Okay, there was extreme prejudice against Asians. I mean, very, very bad. So when you really start to study the experience of Asians, it's incredibly sad. And not just that. I mean, you can go on and talk about more recent future, like the internment of the Japanese, for example, and you know, a lot of things like that we can talk about. You know, and then I jest a lot because when we were talking about Islamophobia, for example, I'm always like, well, what happened? Why don't we hate the Japanese anymore? They blew up Pearl Harbor. You know, I know that you know a very small sect of one group that happens to identify as Muslim decided to take out 9/11 or whatever. But I mean, Pearl Harbor was more extreme than that, you know. So why do we, you know, not hate the Japanese anymore? And then I was joked that you know it's the Cold War. We forgot about the Japanese and we focused on the Russians. You know, because that's you know that's actually what a student told me, and that's why I'm always talking about that. Your students get you thinking about stuff, you know, that you never might not ever thought about again. But you know, we historically were very prejudiced against Asians at different times in history. You have to kind of look at it. Sometimes we're really cool about it. Sometimes we haven't been. And then colorblind racism again comes into hand in hand because, you know, even though we think everyone's cool and no one has a problem with someone who's Asian, is that actually true? You know, are Asians still discriminated against? You know, is that kind of built in there? And so again, the experience of being Asian in America, you know, even though the level of intolerance isn't as bad against Asians as it is some other minority groups, for example, I mean, it's just impossible to be a minority and not escape prejudice and discrimination. Your group does talk about all the different groups, okay? Talks about little things about each group that are relevant. You know, with Asian Americans, it talks about how they were denied citizenship along with all other Asians, okay? They had a similar experience to Arab Americans when it comes to their economic profile and how they're assimilating the United culture. and what kind of jobs they take and what kind of businesses they start, for example. It talks about the diversity of religion amongst people from India. You can't just assume that they're Hindu. That's just be a false assumption, for example. Being in India involves Sikh, it involves being a Muslim, it involves being Hindu. There's aspects of Christianity in there, and so deep, deep cultural roots there. People from India have definitely adopted to much of U.S. culture and been assimilated. A lot of that has to do with just maintaining ties to India is difficult because it is so far away and so hard to get to from the United States, for example. Okay, so the experience of being an Indian in America may not, again, have as much discrimination as someone who was African American or Hispanic, for example. But again, it's just no matter what, as a minority, you can't avoid it. It's just part of the United States. That's why we're trying to make things better. Okay. Um, so symbolic ethnicity, it might not be directly to their country, but the holding on to Indian culture is very important. Okay, Filipino Americans is a new thing we need to really start studying so we can get some more better subjective experience of Filipino Americans. Are they finding the same opportunities to educational attainment as other Asian groups, for example? And you're finding not as much, but there is little documentation. One good access for a lot of minority groups and one way to get citizenship rights, for example, is through by joining the U.S. military. This has kind of changed in the last couple of years, but up until recently, generally, if you can join the military and find some access through the military, you can get into the country. Filipino Americans, a lot of it became agricultural labor for a while. However, they're now, over time, again, as you see these educational rates of all Asians increasing, are beginning to bank on that. Okay, Korean Americans, again, there was a lot of discrimination because of the war. This also happened with North and South Vietnamese after the war. Christianity is very big in the culture, and commonly they migrate to urban areas. But again, the Korean culture is just so diverse compared to all other Asian cultures that every time we're studying this stuff, you realize that each one of these groups has such a unique, diverse history. And then, so no introduction book is going to cover that. You guys are introduction to diversity. To talk about Asian Americans, for example, I mean, that's each group is a class. And even then, you can barely even scratch the surface. Okay. Same thing with Southeast Asians. A lot of them have come in waves, and the lowest educational rates among Asian groups comes from Southeast Asians. And again, we have to look at why. Is it just cultural differences? What are the cultural differences between these groups? Again, are they all one big race? Do they all blend? Or is it an ethnicity that they're all blended? Or are they all just totally separate groups? I just have so many questions, and I hope you're asking those too, okay? Again, Hawaiians, the United States took over. We forced the king to abdicate. We took its throne, made it part of United States. By 1900, only 30,000 natives were actually left, okay? Again, we overthrew the monarchy. They've tried to be on their own, but again, the United States is never going to let go of Hawaii, just like it's never going to let go of Puerto Rico, who's also tried to push for that same exact thing, okay? So that's the stuff you guys need to be thinking about. Just, the experience of one is conquering, and the experience of migration and immigration and the America just tends to put its feet in a lot of countries. And then why are we at war over there so often? We're still at war with North Vietnam. I mean, we just have a peace right now. So, I mean, there's just such a big, broad topic here when we're talking about Asian Americans, and we're talking about the experiences of it. Like, I've studied so many of the subjective experiences of South Vietnamese people coming over from the United States after the Vietnam War, having lost their entire family, and then coming to America to make a new life. And then, and just there's so many experiences. It's just impossible to cover in a day. So that's why I kind of have to throw that disclaimer out. I feel like, I wish we could just go deep into each one of these. And so, again, I recommend anthropology classes. Looking into these cultures is super interesting because, I just have so much to talk about. Okay. There's a big stigma of the Asian being a model minority and how that might handicap other groups of people. And so I put that into the discussion because it's something I want you to think about. So be thinking about that. Again, look at how stereotypes, even positive stereotypes, can have these interesting effects, okay? Especially on other minority groups. Again, it's an honor talking to you. Asian Americans is a rich, cultural, and deep history of, thousands of years. I'm obsessed with all the Chinese emperors, for example, and just going back through the dynasties and then studying the history of Asia is just absolutely fascinating. And there's just so many groups and millions and billions of people. I mean, it's just so rich. But what's their experience in the United States? And again, it's just been back and forth is the overarching theme that I would suggest. Because at sometimes in the United States history, we're so positive, and at sometimes we're so negative. And I don't know if that just is an up and down swing with each generation and how that really plays over. But there's just a lot of stuff to think about. And again, what does it mean to be an Asian American? I mean, does someone who's from Mongolia really identify with someone who's from India? Are they really one race? Are they even one ethnicity? So even to group all Asians into an ethnicity, a common way of life, is really a hard thing for me to accept because I don't really recognize that someone from Afghanistan, someone from Afghanistan is not really Arab, are they? And they're not really Asian, are they? So where does an Arab, if someone from Afghanistan or someone from Ural, where are they from? What do they identify with? So where does Asian end and another ethnicity begin? And is Asian just a bunch of ethnicities, hence the pan ethnicity? Or are they totally separate groups and that Asian is just kind of doing an injustice by grouping too much into one category? And so when I think about Asian, I really think about it like they're putting too much into one category. It's even as with all of my critiques of categories, if we're going to make up a category, I almost want to subdivide it into like north, middle, west, east, south, southeast, southwest, then divided by religion, then divided by it's just so that's the stuff I need you guys to be thinking about. That's sociology. How does it all work? Let's question the system. Let's question the organization. Let's, look into what's going on here. And does this actually even make sense? Because to me, Asian doesn't make sense. It's too broad. It's way too broad. But that's how I feel about white. Russia to Europe to America. It's too broad. I mean, is a Russian the same ethnic group as someone that's American white? And is an African American and someone from Africa, they even share common ethnicity. So you should really have a distinction between people from Africa and then somebody who's black who living in America. And so again, I'm just constantly questioning the categories. Hence, me going into this lecture, all I could think about was more and more and more and more questions. Because every time I talk, I just keep having more and more questions. But that's the beauty of sociology. That's why I'm questioning race in the first place. Like, what? Race does not make sense to me. Stop calling me white. I'm a mestizo if I'm anything. Just a grouping of a bunch of biologies in one. Have a wonderful week. Please email with any questions.